Now, obviously, we will do the political fallout from Tuesday night's first televised leaders' debate amongst the people who could be Prime Minister, because there was a Scottish one on Monday. But before we do that, give me the planes, trains and automobiles behind the scenes. Because you were all in Salford.
We were all in Salford.
Like every political journalist in Britain, minus me. Because I was here in my living room.
You were missed.
Thanks.
It was this kind of like slow trickle of like people rocking up in different parts of Salford at different times, all having got various trains to get there. And I think I bumped into Chris in Salford in the reception of a hotel.
Oh, yeah.
Very
that's
late
right.
at night.
Yes.
And there was a sort of boom from a crowd. Alex, Chris, what on earth are you doing here? Well, we know what, just didn't weirdly expect paths to cross. But then the worst bit was the getting back from Salford this morning, right, Chris? It was a bit tricky.
So the trains on I was going to say the West Coast Main Line, but it's kind of the line between Manchester and London were up the spouse, I think, basically, but at least a lot of them were. But your journey, I think some people took about 5 hours. It's normally about 2 hours something, I think.
Yeah, and I happily got on the one train running on time, no delays. Just pure luck.
Whereas we were in, and we'd have been in this anyway, or at least a collection of us would, in our election van, which we are trundling around the country.
The Mason-mobile.
The Mason-mobile, which doesn't have any windows in the back.
Does it have a fridge?
So no, it doesn't. So no, it's definitely lo-fi and low-tech compared with Angela Rayner's bus. I think that was the reference you were making, wasn't it? And yeah, no, not even any windows in the back. It's quite good actually, because I can just work away without getting distracted. Think, oh, it's a lovely view or whatever. So yeah.
Okay, that's the traffic and travel. On with the news in this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris on a rare trip to the capital in the studio.
And it's Alex also in the studio.
So the election debate that happened in Salford on Tuesday night between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, I took my lead from that YouGov poll, which came out quite soon afterwards, saying that amongst the people they'd sampled, 51% of people said that Rishi Sunak had won. 49% of people said that they thought Keir Starmer had done best. But then, Alex, during the day on Wednesday, we got some opinion polls from other companies flipping it around the other way.
Yeah, and I think, well, two things you can take from that. The first thing is that we frequently say is that you have to treat every opinion poll with a pinch of salt because it's only one and only a pattern really counts. And the second thing I think you can take from that is the broad conclusion that no one really won. Do you know what I mean? There wasn't a kind of standout winner or a standout loser. There wasn't a knockout blow, and therefore it leaves the question as how much does this really change the direction of the campaign? Not to say there weren't important things in it that have then developed.
The one thing that intrigued me about the polls, and the other two, the Savanta poll and the JL Partners poll that came out this morning, actually the gap that they suggested between the relative performance of the two of them was wider in Keir Starmer's favour than the very small gap in Rishi Sunak's favour in the YouGov poll. The thing I found myself pondering, and I don't really know the answer to this, so bear with me, is that if you look at all three of those polls and insert all the caveats that Alex does, I found myself thinking, whatever the gap is between them, and let's look at those ones where Keir Starmer has an apparent lead, that gap seemed narrower than some of the wider opinion polls suggest is the gap in popularity between the Conservatives and Labour. Now, we're comparing apples with pears because in party political opinion polls, there's a far greater spread of options. And also, just because you were watching the telly and concluded man A or man B won doesn't necessarily mean it was sufficient to alter how you might vote. But I just thought, just to throw that into the mix around it. But yeah, I think you're right, Alex. In the round, did anyone? It's always hard, this sort of who won, isn't it?
What is victory?
Sort of, what is victory? But I think given where Rishi Sunak was, as we reflected last night, where Rishi Sunak was psychologically and with his own party, he came out looking like he had plenty of fight in him. And I think that matters, even if only for morale on his side and nothing else.
I think maybe the more relevant question in the debates to come, and of course last night's, is maybe not who won, in inverted commas, but did anyone really lose? I.e., is the sort of jeopardy and danger of a huge mistake greater than maybe a sort of narrow edge of victory in this campaign, because that actually might end up going on to have much more consequence.
And also just that whole thing of Rishi Sunak sort of drawing equal or just going ahead of Keir Starmer in one poll might feel like a massive victory to some Conservatives because in the other polls they're so far behind Labour. So actually, a draw is winning. Even if we're then looking at other polls, which show something completely different. Anyway, I have learned over the years that my predictive skills are not very good. I have, amongst friends in the pub, when things have been happening, I've predicted something and they've inevitably ended up being wrong. I'm happy to admit that. And that's why I don't make predictions anymore. Apart from last night. Oh, they didn't even stick to my script. Like a leader performing badly in a
You have a
debate.
script?
My mental script.
Oh, right, sorry.
Well, what's that?
Touche.
Chris has a notepad in front of him if you're not watching this and just listening. As soon as the Labour are going to put up your taxes by £2,000, I said that is going to become a big deal. I wasn't sure in which direction the deal was going to go, whether it would be disastrous for Labour because people would be then be like, hang on, what are they not telling us? Or whether it would backfire on the person who's making the claim, Rishi Sunak. It's kind of gone a bit in both directions, hasn't it?
So Rishi Sunak made the claim loads and loads of times on the programme. It took, as we were reflecting last time, quite a while for Keir Starmer to knock it down and say it was false. Then this morning, Claire Coutinho, who is a cabinet minister, was doing what's known as the morning round, popping up on various media outlets. And she's a cabinet minister, but she's also a really close ally of Rishi Sunak. In fact, they worked together at the Treasury when he was a minister and she was a special advisor. And she made the same point, but without much caveating, said that this number had come about via independent Treasury analysis. Now, some elements of that number had come about by political appointees, Conservative advisors, asking the Treasury civil servants to do some number crunching based on their own political assumptions about elements of Labour's spending plan. Midway through this round that Claire Coutinho was doing, Labour published a letter that they'd got a couple of days ago from the most senior civil servant in the Treasury in response to a letter that Labour had written to him, in which this most senior civil servant said, look, not all of what the Conservatives are claiming in this number, this £2,000 additional tax claim number, did come from the numbers that we crunched, and we have made that clear to ministers that they shouldn't be claiming otherwise. Claire Coutinho explicitly referred to the Permanent Secretary, this most senior civil servant.
A guy called James Bowler.
Yeah, and then appears this letter by him, as I say, published by Labour. I mean, he'd sent it a couple of days ago. It appeared in the middle of all of this row. Unpicking one element, and there's a few we can pick away at, around the misleading nature, frankly, of that Conservative claim.
There's so much we could discuss about this. Let's break it down into chunks. So let's talk about just actually take apart the £2,000 figure. So, I mean, my first kind of issue with it as somebody who cares about accuracy and statistics is, well, it's a sort of meaningless number on its own terms because it's assuming every household pays the same amount of tax and any changes would be applied equally to every single household. So even just from a basic arithmetic point of view, it is not accurate to the world.
Also, even if you have no issue with any of the mathematics, it is timesed by 4 because it's talking about over a 4-year period. And I guess most people, to the extent to which we think about tax bills and whatever, are likely to think of them on an annual basis. Then there's the issue
or even monthly.
Yeah. Then there's the issue about the role of the Treasury. Secondly, sort of making clear the fact that the Treasury does the numbers, and there's a convention here, and previous governments of various colours have done it, that they run the numbers based on the assumptions handed to them, as I say, by the political advisors. There's an element in the document which refers to what is Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, as they call it. Labour say they have a means of funding that. And there's another claim that wasn't part of what the Treasury did that the think tank, the Institute for Government, had looked at, which they have publicly said today itself. It was only one element of all of this, but that was misleading. So we've had, just to sort of be transparent about how the reporting of this works.
Yeah, do the media studies bit, because it's been quite interesting.
So in a situation like this, where you have the Conservatives making this claim, you have Labour, you have Keir Starmer this afternoon calling it a lie. So you've got Conservatives saying X and Labour saying Y. Those two things are in mutual contradiction, apparently. So journalistically, how do you report that? Do you just say X and Y and leave it at that? That, I think, is unsatisfactory because you're not really helping our audience understand.
I mean, it would be a version of impartiality, though, which is what we're meant to
It would
do
arguably
now.
be a version of it, but it wouldn't actually help, I don't think. And that's kind of fundamental to what we should be doing in this election, which is trying to help people reach an informed judgment about what the parties are saying. There's also another dilemma, which is that when you report this sort of stuff, the fact that we are talking about it on Newscast is giving it prominence. We recall on Brexitcast talking about the 350 million quid on the side of the Vote Leave bus, that idea that the UK sent that amount of money to Brussels every week, which was wrong.
Because that was the total amount we sent, not taking into account anything that came back.
Exactly. It was a gross number, not a net number. But that number was very prominent, not least because there was all of the rows about it. Now, as I say, that was wrong. This claim is misleading. I think the label that I think is reasonable to attach to it is different, but the prominence question is the same one. So as a reporter, as a collection of reporters, I mean, you could choose just not to do it. You could say, you know what? We're not going to do it. What use is this figure to our audience, to newscasters and elsewhere? We're not going to do it. But that's an active choice as well. And would it be right for us not to report on the most lively and contentious argument in politics today?
Well, because it would feel a bit like censorship.
Well,
almost.
indeed, yeah. So
Or editorialising.
Yeah. So for what it's worth, in my judgment, we should cover it. We should cover the row. We should explain why we've decided to do what we've done, which is what I'm attempting to do now, and then set out our workings as to why we're giving something a label, so that a newscaster or a wider listener or reader or viewer can come to a view as to whether or not they think our label is a reasonable one based on the facts that we have presented.
And that was a very clear explanation of presumably what's been going on in your head for the last 22 hours.
Yeah,
And
or to do it visually.
a meme is born, or a GIF, or a GIF, however it's pronounced. And what label have we ended up with
in
then?
your kitchen table with.
No, it's. Let's not get into this.
Oh, right.
It's a
Don't
very
get into
online thing. And so the label for this we've ended up with is.
So I think it is reasonable on the basis of what I've just said to say it is dubious and to say it is misleading. It is clearly possible for someone hearing that number, particularly if they don't hear the wider context, to be misled. I should say, by the way, that Labour have also made some contentious claims about the Conservatives' spending plans and taxing plans, not least around national insurance.
Oh, yeah, because I was going to say to Alex, just remind us how some of the other parties have been doing something of this ilk.
Well, before the debate, which was quite interesting last night, there is, as I mentioned, this room where all the journalists gather. Now, in that room, Jonathan Ashworth, who is Labour's Shadow Paymaster General, was walking around pre-debate with what he called a dossier, so a wad of papers that Labour had drawn up and stapled together with what they claimed was outlining all of the Conservatives' unfunded spending commitments, which amounted to billions of pounds. So there is claim and counterclaim on each side. But back to Chris's point about why this 2,000 figure has got such traction today is because Rishi Sunak repeated it live on air in a debate in front of millions of people,
4.6 million people.
and time again. And I think, when something has been given that prominence by one of the players involved, it's only right that you do an examination of the kind of, the accuracy of the claim that he was making. But other parties are throwing around this kind of stuff as well. And of course, this argument around unfunded spending commitments or spending commitments at all is a hugely key part of this election campaign, which is why you're seeing it from both sides. And the other bit that's chucked round is that parties do point out that other parties have asked civil servants to do costings of their opponents' plans in the past. So, it's convoluted, but I think it's important you try and unpick it because, what Rishi Sunak wanted people to be left with was you're going to be £2,000 worse off under Labour because your taxes are going to go up. And, if that is based, as Chris has said, on dubious or presentation, then it's only right that that's kind of called out.
Yeah. But then the political strategy, from... Now, the Conservatives, by the way, I should also say on all of this, reckon that at least some of their numbers are a underestimate of of what the bill could be or the cost could be. But I think, as I say, when you unpack the whole thing, I think it's reasonable to come to that conclusion. And there'll be bigger arguments going on in both of the two big Westminster parties as to whether or not, back to the prominence point, this very row, who this very row serves, because does it somehow drip into the sort of bloodstream for the vast majority of people who pay not a vast amount of attention to politics, that there's this thing going on about Labour and higher taxes, even if the number doesn't even cross their path, if you like, versus, I suppose, that kind of sense of, does it dent the Conservatives' believability or credibility if there's a sense that folk are saying, hang on a minute, that doesn't sound right.
Because, of course, the thing here that the Conservatives, as you say, are being pointed to with a question mark over their approach is not because they are making the suggestion that there might be unfunded spending commitments. They're entitled to make that suggestion or have that as an attack line, as Labour have done to the Conservatives. It's the fact they've put a figure on it and attributed that figure to the Treasury without the wider context. And so you wonder if by doing that, as Chris said, they've now got people talking about it for 24 hours. I mean, I don't know what that strategy is, and I'm not professing to, but you have to have all of that in your mind as you try and navigate this.
And it plays into that broader strategy that we've seen from the Conservatives in the last fortnight. It is by the way, now 2 weeks of election
happy
campaigning.
anniversary.
Oh, cheers, everyone.
2 weeks done and 4 weeks to go. Not that we're counting, but that's kind of where we are. 2 weeks ago when I was getting soaked in Downing Street. Actually, I completely lost my train of thought.
Any particular garments? Got particular? No, let's not dwell on that again. I know, but I'll pick up from you for what you were saying there, though, Chris. I mean, there's still a bit more of this to run because the Office of the Statistical Regulator is looking into it. I've seen this sort of thing happen all the time where people get reported to the watchdogs and then a few weeks later the watchdogs go, oh, that wasn't quite an accurate use of stats, and it comes at no cost to the person who said the initial stat.
Because water's under the bridge.
Yeah, I just wonder, though, with this level of scrutiny and the fact that the top bod at the Treasury has been so explicit, this feels like a different kind of, like a higher DEFCON of that.
Yeah, and this is the point I was going to make and I'd forgotten, which is that arguably last night then slots into what we've seen on the Conservative strategy of the last fortnight, which is to say stuff that generates headlines, basically, grab attention. We've seen it with the various policy announcements. They've had far more, certainly compared with Labour, new eye-catching policy announcements since the calling of the election. To try and, because they need to, given where it appears they are, opinion poll-wise, to change the weather and to get noticed.
I mean, I don't know if you know the answer to this, and they probably haven't said, but this letter was sent to Labour on the 3rd.
Yes.
The debate was on the 4th.
Yes. It
got leaked to our colleague Henry Zeffman on the morning of the 5th. I mean, part of me thinks if they just published it on the 3rd or the 4th, we wouldn't be having this conversation, or we would have had it 2 days ago.
But yeah, and I think part of what
or maybe Rishi Sunak wouldn't have said it, or he would have said it with more asterisks attached.
Yeah, I mean, Labour just published this today, let's be clear, and we should say that explicitly so as to not imply that this was published by the civil service.
Oh yeah, it's not like a press release from the Treasury.
They were responding to a letter that Darren Jones, the Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, had written to the Permanent Secretary at the Treasury, asking about, hang on a minute, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I keep losing my train of thought.
Well,
you have been working for like 96 hours a day for now 2 weeks.
That's perfectly entitled. I think there's something interesting in that. So Labour had this letter, this response from the Treasury for 2 days before they chose to publish it. And there was also that question around why during the debate it took as long as it did for Keir Starmer to shoot down that claim.
They could have published it during the debate.
He could have published it during the debate. And actually, it was quite a way in before he even alluded to the fact that this was based on not just Treasury analysis, but also political analysis.
And also Westminster journalists would have loved the drama of that dropping in the middle of the
I don't
debate.
have any insight, Chris, you might, as to how that unfolded within Labour.
So I think it is not unreasonable to observe that part of what we have seen today has been the equal and opposite of what we didn't see last night. In other words, that there are figures within Labour who feel that that Keir Starmer made a mistake last night to not more prominently and frequently demolish that claim as it was made. Now, you might argue that would have drawn more attention to it or whatever, but anyway, there is an argument that has said perhaps he should have been more vociferous in saying, it's false, which he did do in the end. And the response, therefore, today has been to, if not overcorrect, then certainly be very vociferous. So you had Jonathan Ashworth this morning calling it a lie. You had Rachel Reeves popping up doing a video, the Shadow Chancellor, where she said, I won't put any taxes on working people, on national insurance and income tax and VAT. And then you had Keir Starmer. I did wonder, so Keir Starmer did a little clip in Portsmouth connected to, because he's been doing the D-Day things, about all of this. And I thought, I wonder if he'll just be a bit softer in his language than, say, Jonathan Ashworth. Because the L word is a big word. Big word. That's very different from saying something might mislead or is dubious. It's talking about an active attempt to say an untruth. That's a big accusation. And Keir Starmer did it.
Well, two things just to end this bit of the newscast, and we'll talk about other stuff. Some of these debates in the past don't have a very long afterlife, and they come, the fireworks go off, everyone goes to bed, everyone hopefully gets their train home eventually. This has had a much longer afterlife than most of these events. And second of all, the L word, the liar word. I was quite a long way into my political journalism career when someone explained to me the reason they're called honourable members in Parliament is because you're meant to be not capable of lying. So when one politician calls another politician a liar, okay, that might not seem that big a deal in normal speech, but in kind of political speech, it's a big deal.
Really quick
cultural.
You've also just got to wonder, as a pullback, as we talk about this, what that claim and counterclaim and accusations and figures and whatever thrown around just does to people watching all of this and looking on and thinking, blimey, we're 2 weeks into an election campaign. I've got to make a decision about the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who that's going to be. And this claim and counterclaim is where we're at.
Alex, thank you very much.
Pleasure as always.
And Chris, thanks to you too.
Thank you.
Newscast from the BBC.